The US has hundreds of aircraft deployed in the Middle East. They all have different roles and some are very specialist. They have a mixture of stealth features and advanced avionics to dominate the airspace.
The scale is impossible to ignore. More than 120 American warplanes repositioned toward the Middle East in just days. Dozens of F-16. Multiple squadrons of F-35 stealth fighters. A contingent of F-22 Raptors, the most advanced air superiority jets ever built. Over 40 aerial refueling tankers stretching range deep into contested skies. Airborne command aircraft orbiting silently. Carrier strike groups anchoring both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea. And far from the headlines, long-range bombers in the United States quietly raised to higher readiness. At first glance, it looks like a show of strength, an unmistakable signal. But the deeper question is far more serious. If this much force is moving into place, what exactly is Washington preparing for? Why this isn't a simple strike? On paper, American air power is overwhelming. The combination of F-22 stealth dominance, F-35 sensor fusion, electronic warfare platforms, and precision munitions is unmatched. No regional air force comes close in a head-to-head fight. But this is not 2003, and this is not Iraq. Over the last 2 decades, Iran has built its entire military doctrine around one central reality. It cannot win a conventional war against the United States. So instead, it has focused on making any attack painfully expensive. Its air defense network is layered and increasingly domestic. Systems like the Bavar 373 long-range missile platform were developed specifically to reduce reliance on foreign suppliers. The network is not perfect. It has vulnerabilities, but it is not hollow. Even stealth aircraft face risk inside dense, overlapping radar coverage supported by mobile surface-to-air missile batteries. The goal is not to stop every jet. The goal is to complicate targeting and increase uncertainty. Then there is Iran's missile arsenal. Hundreds of short and medium-range ballistic missiles, many road-mobile, many hidden in hardened underground facilities. They are designed for rapid dispersal. They are designed for retaliation. If American airstrikes begin, missile launches would likely follow within hours. Not because of emotion, because of doctrine. Iran's strategy is built on immediate escalation to impose cost before it loses airspace control. Look closely at the force package. 40-plus refueling tankers do not support a single night of limited strikes. They support sustained air operations over days or weeks. Multiple airborne command and control platforms do not deploy for symbolic gestures. They deploy when planners expect a complex, multi-axis campaign. Reinforced Patriot missile batteries across regional bases are not offensive tools. They are defensive shields, and their presence signals something critical. American planners expect retaliation. This does not look like confidence in a quick, clean operation. It looks like preparation for a prolonged exchange. The first 72 hours. If conflict begins, Iran's conventional air force would likely be neutralized quickly. Much of its fighter inventory consists of aging platforms. F-14 Tomcats and F-4 Phantoms acquired decades ago, supplemented by older Russian aircraft. Maintenance under years of sanctions has been difficult. Pilots may be experienced, but the aircraft themselves face serious limitations against stealth fighters supported by advanced airborne radar systems. Within 48 to 72 hours, Iran's traditional air combat capability would likely be heavily degraded. But that was never its real deterrent. The real strategy activates after those aircraft are grounded. Mobile missile launchers disperse across vast terrain. Drone swarms begin saturating radar coverage. Underground storage sites cycle launch sequences designed to overwhelm missile defenses. The objective shifts from defending airspace to imposing consequences. The drone equation. Iran has invested heavily in low-cost drone warfare. Loitering munitions, reconnaissance platforms, and swarm-capable systems designed not for elegance, but for volume. Each individual drone may be inexpensive, but when launched in coordinated waves, they force defenders to make a brutal economic choice: intercept or absorb. Advanced air defense systems like Patriot missiles are effective, but each interceptor is costly. When dozens or hundreds of low-cost drones approach simultaneously from multiple vectors, the arithmetic becomes uncomfortable. Saturation is the strategy. Even if most are intercepted, some get through, and the psychological impact compounds quickly. Then comes the wider network. Proxy forces across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Militia groups with rockets, drones, and missiles of their own. Infrastructure targets across the Gulf. Shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 1/5 of global oil flows daily. If the conflict widens, it does not remain an air campaign. Energy markets would react instantly. Oil prices could spike sharply in the opening days. Countries heavily dependent on Gulf energy imports would feel immediate pressure, and global powers would watch carefully. China imports significant oil from the region. Russia has its own strategic calculations. Neither would be eager to enter direct conflict, but both would assess how the situation reshapes global balance. No war planner can model every variable once escalation begins. The aircraft are real. The deployments are measurable. The hardware is extraordinary. But history shows that air superiority alone does not end wars. The real question is not whether the United States can strike. It clearly can. The question is what happens after the first wave, and whether anyone truly controls what comes next. The strait that can shake the world. If airstrikes begin, attention will immediately shift to one narrow stretch of water: the Strait of Hormuz. It is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, but nearly 20% of the world's oil passes through it every single day. Iran has spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. Fast attack boats, naval mines, coastal anti-ship missile batteries hidden along rugged shoreline, submarines designed for shallow water operations, swarm tactics meant to overwhelm larger vessels. The goal would not necessarily be permanent closure. Even temporary disruption would be enough. Insurance rates for shipping would skyrocket overnight. Tanker traffic would slow. Energy markets would react instantly. Oil could spike sharply before traders even understand the duration of the disruption. For countries heavily dependent on Gulf energy, including major Asian economies, the shock would be immediate. Energy is not just fuel. It is inflation. It is supply chains. It is political stability. A regional air war could quickly become a global economic event. Israel's immediate dilemma. If strikes hit Iranian targets, Israel would prepare for retaliation within hours. Hezbollah in Lebanon possesses a large arsenal of rockets and precision-guided missiles, far larger than what existed in past conflicts. Militia groups in Syria and Iraq have drone and rocket capabilities as well. Israel's layered missile defense systems, Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, are advanced and battle-tested. But they are not infinite. High-volume barrages over days or weeks stress any defense system. Interceptors run low. Decision-making becomes harder. Civilian shelters fill. Economic activity slows. If missile fire intensifies significantly, Israeli ground forces could mobilize rapidly. That opens the door to a multi-front regional conflict, one far more complex than a limited air campaign against Iranian infrastructure. And once multiple fronts ignite, containing escalation becomes exponentially harder. Gulf states on the front line. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates host American forces and infrastructure. That makes them strategically vital and potentially vulnerable. Oil processing facilities, export terminals, desalination plants, and air bases become high-value targets. In 2019, drone and missile attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure temporarily removed a significant portion of global supply in a single strike. In a broader conflict, similar facilities would be prime targets again. The calculus is simple. Impose global economic pressure to shorten the war. Damage to major energy infrastructure would not just affect the region. It would affect markets worldwide within hours. Every government would feel the impact. Carrier strike groups symbolize American power projection, floating air bases capable of launching dozens of sorties per day. But they are not invulnerable. Iran has invested heavily in anti-ship missiles, both land-based and sea-launched. It has developed maneuvering ballistic missile variants designed specifically to target large naval vessels. Even if the probability of a successful strike remains low, the presence of that capability forces American naval planners to operate cautiously. Defense layers would include Aegis missile systems, fighter patrols, electronic warfare support, and layered interceptors. The carriers remain formidable. But in a dense missile environment, every deployment becomes a calculated risk. The proxy activation risk. Iran's deterrent strategy is distributed. Militia groups across the region operate with varying degrees of independence, but maintain strategic alignment. In a major confrontation, many would likely activate simultaneously. Rocket fire on U.S. bases in Iraq, drone strikes against regional infrastructure, attacks along shipping routes, cyber operations targeting financial systems or logistics networks. The goal would be diffusion, stretching American defensive resources across multiple fronts at once. No single attack needs to be decisive. Cumulative pressure is enough. The global powers watching. China imports significant oil from the Gulf. A prolonged disruption directly impacts its economy. Beijing may avoid direct military involvement, but intelligence sharing, satellite monitoring, or diplomatic maneuvering remain possibilities. Russia, already engaged elsewhere, would likely welcome a shift of American focus away from Europe. Quiet technical assistance, electronic warfare support, or intelligence coordination cannot be ruled out in a prolonged conflict. Neither country needs to fire a shot to shape outcomes. Geopolitics rarely stays contained. Winning the air isn't winning the war. The United States would likely dominate the initial air battle. Air defense networks would be degraded. Known military infrastructure would take heavy damage. Command nodes would be targeted. On those narrow military metrics, the outcome is predictable. But history has shown that early air dominance does not automatically translate into strategic success. Long-term sustainability, political will, economic pressure, and alliance stability often determine the real outcome. Iran's strategy is not built around defeating American air power directly. It is built around surviving it. and raising the cost of continuing. That distinction changes everything. The aircraft are positioned, the tankers are orbiting, the carriers are deployed. The question is no longer about capability. It is about endurance. And endurance wars rarely unfold the way planners expect. The political clock starts ticking. The moment the first strike lands, another countdown begins, not in the skies, but in Washington. Modern conflicts are not fought in isolation from public opinion. Images travel instantly. Casualties, on any side, circulate within minutes. Oil prices flash across screens. Markets react before governments do. The United States has unmatched military capability. But sustained operations require political endurance. Iran understands this deeply. Its planners have studied previous American wars carefully. Not just battlefield tactics, but timelines, public support curves, congressional pressure, election cycles. The objective would not be to win militarily in a traditional sense. It would be to outlast. Every missile that forces a base into lockdown, every drone that slips through, every oil spike that raises fuel prices globally. These become strategic tools. Conflict becomes a war of patience, and patience can be fragile. The cyber front. Modern warfare does not stay confined to physical space. Iran has developed significant cyber capabilities over the last decade. Financial institutions, energy grids, logistics networks, and communication systems could become targets. Cyber operations are attractive because they blur escalation thresholds. Attribution can be murky. Retaliation becomes complicated. Temporary disruptions to banking systems or infrastructure may not win battles, but they create instability. And instability compounds. In a prolonged exchange, cyber actions could run parallel to missile launches and drone swarms, forcing defensive agencies to divide attention across domains. The battlefield is no longer just air and sea. It is digital. The escalation ladder. One of the most dangerous elements in any conflict is escalation miscalculation. If American strikes hit deeper than anticipated, retaliation may escalate accordingly. If retaliation causes unexpected civilian casualties, pressure builds for further response. Each move forces a countermove, and each countermove raises the stakes. Military planners call this the escalation ladder. Once climbing begins, stepping back down becomes politically and psychologically difficult. History is filled with conflicts that began as limited actions but expanded beyond original intent. The presence of multiple actors, state and non-state, increases unpredictability. Even a single misinterpreted radar track or accidental strike could accelerate escalation dramatically. How long would this last? Days? Weeks? Months? If initial strikes degrade Iranian infrastructure significantly, Washington may seek rapid de-escalation. But if retaliation intensifies regionally, pressure to continue operations grows. Air campaigns consume enormous logistical resources: tankers, munitions, maintenance cycles, pilot rotations, sustained tempo strains even advanced militaries. Meanwhile, regional allies face domestic pressure of their own. Energy-dependent economies absorb economic shock. Political opposition movements gain traction. Public anxiety rises. Wars rarely follow neat timelines, and once supply chains and markets react, economic consequences can outlast military action. The nuclear variable. While conventional forces dominate immediate planning, one shadow hangs quietly over everything: Iran's nuclear program. If conflict escalates, there is risk that nuclear facilities become targets. Such strikes carry their own consequences: environmental, political, and strategic. Alternatively, prolonged conflict may accelerate Iran's determination to pursue nuclear deterrence more aggressively. The nuclear question is not always about immediate use. It is about long-term strategic calculation. Every strike alters that calculation. The cost imbalance. Modern warfare is expensive for both sides, but not always symmetrically. High-end stealth aircraft cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Advanced interceptors cost millions per launch. Low-cost drones cost a fraction. When defense requires expensive interceptors to defeat cheap incoming threats, economic asymmetry becomes part of the strategy. Sustained saturation tactics can strain stockpiles quickly. Replenishment takes time. Manufacturing lines are not infinite. The longer a conflict lasts, the more cost ratios begin to matter. And cost matters politically. So what does the massive air deployment really mean? It could be deterrence, an attempt to prevent escalation by showing overwhelming readiness. It could be preparation for a limited strike package. Or it could be contingency planning for a scenario no one wants, but everyone is preparing for. The hardware is impressive. The readiness appears serious. But military strength does not remove uncertainty. It simply raises the stakes. The opening hours of any conflict would likely favor American air power decisively. But beyond the first 72 hours, the picture becomes complex. Regional retaliation, global economic shock, proxy activation, cyber warfare, political pressure. This is not a binary outcome. It is a cascade. And cascades are difficult to predict once they begin. The illusion of control. Every modern military campaign begins with detailed planning, target lists, timelines, expected retaliation scenarios, war-gamed contingencies layered upon contingencies. But war rarely unfolds according to spreadsheets. Once aircraft cross into contested airspace and the first weapons are released, control begins to thin. Pilots make split-second decisions. Radar systems interpret ambiguous signals. Intelligence updates shift targeting mid-operation. Communications can fail. The larger the operation, the more moving parts exist. With over 100 aircraft operating in overlapping corridors, supported by tankers, surveillance planes, electronic warfare platforms, naval vessels, and ground-based missile defenses, the operational complexity becomes enormous. One miscalculation does not need to be catastrophic to matter. It only needs to trigger a chain reaction. Behind every aircraft and missile are human operators. Pilots flying long missions over hostile territory face intense mental pressure. Air defense crews make rapid decisions under saturation conditions. Naval commanders balance aggressive posture with defensive caution. Fatigue accumulates quickly in sustained operations. Mistakes become more likely as tempo increases. Iranian forces face similar stress. Missile crews operating under threat of immediate strike must disperse quickly and communicate securely. Drone operators coordinate swarm launches under electronic interference. High-intensity conflict compresses decision time, and compressed decision time increases risk. Air power dominance depends on logistics. Every sortie requires fuel, maintenance, spare parts, and munitions replenishment. Precision-guided weapons stockpiles are finite. Replacement production lines operate on months-long cycles, not days. Sustained high-tempo air campaigns consume resources rapidly. Tankers must remain airborne for extended durations. Carrier decks operate around the clock. Maintenance crews work continuous shifts. Even the most advanced military feels strain under prolonged operations. If conflict extends beyond initial expectations, logistical sustainability becomes a central variable. History has repeatedly shown that logistics often determine endurance more than firepower. Modern conflict unfolds in two parallel arenas: the battlefield and the narrative. Iran would likely amplify every successful strike, every intercepted missile, every image of damage. Social media spreads footage instantly, verified or not. Disinformation campaigns could attempt to sow doubt or exaggerate impact. The United States and its allies would counter with their own messaging, emphasizing precision, control, and strategic purpose. Perception matters. Markets respond to perception. Public opinion responds to perception. In prolonged conflicts, the information war can shape political timelines as strongly as battlefield outcomes. Middle Eastern geopolitics is interconnected. A strike on Iranian infrastructure does not stay isolated from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or Yemen. Militia groups operate across porous borders. Political factions shift alignment based on perceived momentum. Governments under internal pressure may recalibrate positions quickly. A single escalation can force neighboring countries into difficult choices. Allow overflight rights, restrict basing access, or distance themselves diplomatically. Each decision reshapes coalition cohesion, and coalition cohesion is essential for sustained operations. Even without direct infrastructure destruction, markets react to risk. Oil futures rise on uncertainty alone. Shipping insurers adjust premiums. Airlines hedge fuel contracts aggressively. Currency markets adjust for instability. For nations heavily reliant on imported energy, short-term price spikes can translate into inflationary pressure. Inflation triggers political consequences. Economic ripple effects may outlast military engagement. This is where localized conflict becomes global stress. What does victory look like? Is it destruction of missile infrastructure? Degradation of nuclear facilities? Restoration of deterrence? Or is it simply preventing escalation from spiraling further? Strategic objectives must be clear before operations begin. If objectives shift mid-conflict, from limited strike to sustained campaign, expectations change rapidly. Iran's likely objective would be survival and cost imposition. America's objective would likely be deterrence restoration and capability degradation. Those goals are not symmetrical, and asymmetrical goals complicate resolution. The aircraft are positioned, the carriers are deployed, missile defenses are reinforced, but none of those facts answer the central uncertainty. If the first wave launches tonight, what happens on day 4? On day 7? On day 30? Does escalation stabilize? Or does it widen? History offers examples in both directions. What makes this moment dangerous is not the hardware. It is the number of actors involved, the speed of modern escalation, and the economic interdependence that ties distant nations into regional conflict. Military power can begin wars decisively. Ending them cleanly is far more complicated. The long war scenario. If the first weeks pass without decisive political resolution, the conflict shifts into a different phase. Airstrikes continue, but targets become harder to find. Mobile launchers disperse more effectively. Underground facilities remain partially operational. Drone production adapts and relocates. The initial shock fades. What remains is endurance. Sustained operations require constant surveillance. Intelligence collection becomes relentless. Satellites track movement. Signals intelligence hunts for launch signatures. Drones monitor suspected dispersal zones around the clock. This becomes a war of detection and denial. Iran does not need to win major engagements. It only needs to continue functioning. And continued functionality becomes a form of resistance. The risk of regional expansion. As time stretches, secondary theaters grow more active. Hezbollah could escalate rocket fire. Militia networks in Iraq may intensify attacks on American bases. Maritime harassment could increase in the Gulf. Even if each front remains limited individually, collectively they stretch attention and resources. A multi-front dynamic creates decision fatigue. Commanders must prioritize, protect shipping lanes, defend bases, intercept missile launches, or continue deep strike operations. Resource allocation becomes strategic triage, and triage is never clean. Domestic pressure on all sides. Inside the United States, political debate would intensify. Supporters argue for strength and deterrence credibility. Critics question cost, duration, and objectives. Fuel prices rise. Markets fluctuate. Media coverage cycles continuously. Inside Iran, leadership frames the conflict as resistance against foreign aggression. Civilian hardship is attributed to external pressure. Nationalism strengthens under threat. Conflicts often solidify internal political unity, at least initially. But prolonged hardship can shift internal dynamics unpredictably. Domestic resilience becomes part of the battlefield. The economic front widens. Energy markets do not respond linearly. Initial spikes can be sharp. If shipping routes remain partially open, prices may stabilize slightly, but volatility persists. Insurance premiums remain elevated. Investment slows in affected regions. Global growth projections adjust downward. Countries heavily dependent on Gulf oil scramble for alternative supply contracts. Energy exporters outside the region benefit temporarily. Geopolitical alignments subtly shift based on economic exposure. Even nations not directly involved feel consequences. The ripple effect becomes strategic leverage. The China variable grows. As the conflict extends, Beijing's calculations evolve. China relies significantly on Gulf energy imports. Prolonged instability challenges supply security. Direct military involvement remains unlikely, but economic diplomacy intensifies. Beijing may push for ceasefire mediation to stabilize markets. Alternatively, it could quietly expand energy purchases from alternative suppliers, reshaping long-term trade flows. Extended conflict offers China strategic breathing space in other theaters. American focus divided between regions reduces flexibility elsewhere. The balance of global attention matters. Russia's strategic window. For Moscow, prolonged American engagement in the Middle East provides indirect relief elsewhere. Even limited intelligence coordination with Iran could complicate American operations without overt involvement. Electronic warfare advice, satellite imagery sharing, or cyber collaboration remain plausible forms of indirect support. No direct confrontation is required. Strategic distraction alone can be advantageous. Military fatigue and adaptation. High-tempo air operations degrade equipment over time. Aircraft require deeper maintenance cycles. Carrier groups rotate. Crews require rest. Precision munitions stocks must be replenished. Iran adapts as well. Launch patterns change. Decoys increase. Electronic warfare intensifies. Each side studies the other's tactics continuously. Adaptation accelerates. The longer conflict persists, the less predictable outcomes become. Initial superiority narrows as opponents learn and adjust. the deterrence question. Ultimately, the central issue becomes deterrence credibility. If strikes significantly degrade missile and drone capabilities, Washington may declare objectives achieved and reduce operations. If retaliation remains persistent and disruptive, calls for deeper strikes grow. Deterrence is psychological. It depends not only on damage inflicted, but on perception of future risk. If Iran emerges operationally intact after sustained strikes, deterrence may weaken. If escalation spirals uncontrollably, deterrence collapses entirely. Managing that balance is extraordinarily difficult. The mass movement of over 120 warplanes is not symbolic. It is preparation. Preparation does not guarantee action, but it signals seriousness. Military power can shape options. It cannot eliminate uncertainty. The decisive variable is not whether aircraft can penetrate airspace. It is whether political leaders on all sides can control escalation once events begin moving faster than intentions. In modern conflict, speed is the most dangerous element. Missiles travel in minutes. Markets react in seconds. Public opinion shifts in days. Strategic consequences unfold in years. The skies may belong to the strongest air force, but the outcome of a regional war depends on endurance, economics, alliances, and political will. And those factors are far harder to measure than the number of aircraft on a runway. The bluff possibility. There is one more possibility that must be considered. What if this entire deployment is not preparation for immediate strikes, but strategic signaling? Mass force movement can serve multiple purposes. It can deter. It can reassure allies. It can pressure adversaries into diplomatic concessions. By positioning overwhelming air power within reach, Washington increases leverage without firing a shot. The message becomes clear. Escalation will be met with overwhelming response. Sometimes the goal of military buildup is to prevent war, not begin it. But deterrence only works if the threat is believable. And credibility depends on readiness. That is why the deployment matters, even if no strike ever occurs. The danger of misreading signals. The problem with large military movements is interpretation. One side calls it deterrence. The other calls it preparation for attack. Defensive reinforcement on one side appears offensive on the other. If intelligence assessments misinterpret intent, precautionary moves can trigger reactive escalation. History contains numerous examples of crises that spiraled not because war was planned, but because leaders feared waiting too long. When forces are already mobilized, decision timelines shrink, and shrinking timelines increase risk. The 72-hour window revisited. Everything returns to the first 3 days. If strikes begin and retaliation is limited, de-escalation may remain possible. If retaliation spreads across multiple fronts simultaneously, missile launches, drone swarms, proxy attacks, shipping disruption, pressure mounts quickly. In that scenario, leaders face a narrowing set of choices: pull back and risk appearing weak, or escalate further and risk widening the war. The first 72 hours shape the narrative, the political climate, and the strategic direction. After that, momentum becomes harder to control. Modern air campaigns have demonstrated overwhelming tactical success. But history also shows that strategic success requires clarity of purpose. In previous Middle Eastern conflicts, air superiority was achieved quickly, yet the broader wars lasted far longer than expected. Costs accumulated, objectives evolved, public support fluctuated, adversaries adapted. Iran's entire defensive doctrine appears built around that lesson: survival over spectacle. It does not need to win traditional battles. It needs to endure long enough to make continuation unattractive. Unlike past conflicts, today's world is tightly interconnected. Energy markets respond instantly. Global supply chains depend on regional stability. Cyber systems connect financial institutions across continents. Regional escalation does not remain regional for long. Even countries far removed geographically feel impact economically. That interconnection raises stakes significantly. A localized strike package could have worldwide consequences within days. The real strategic question: so what does the movement of 120-plus warplanes truly represent? It represents capability. It represents readiness. It represents a government preparing for contingencies that may never unfold. But it also represents risk, because once military power reaches this scale of deployment, pressure builds to use it or justify it. The line between deterrence and action becomes thinner, and that line is often crossed faster than anticipated. The end game nobody controls. If conflict begins, the initial outcome in the air is predictable. Advanced stealth fighters, supported by airborne command and control, will dominate conventional engagements. Missile sites will be targeted, radar systems degraded, infrastructure damaged. But what follows depends less on aircraft and more on reaction. Retaliation patterns, proxy activation, economic shock, political stamina, global alignment shifts. Those variables determine whether conflict burns out quickly or smolders for years. The aircraft are ready. The carriers are in position. The tankers are orbiting. Missile defenses are reinforced. But readiness does not equal inevitability. It means the world is closer to a decision point. Whether this becomes a short demonstration of force, a limited exchange, or the beginning of something far larger depends on choices made in rooms far from runways. Military power can shape outcomes. It cannot guarantee them. And history has a way of punishing overconfidence. For now, the skies remain quiet. But the scale of preparation suggests that everyone involved understands one thing clearly. If the first strike comes, the consequences will not be measured in hours, but in years.